Well, today we're going to look at the design history of a little two-seat commuter car that Pontiac introduced in 1984 and which ran through 1988, and that was the Pontiac Fiero. Again, the Fiero was not sold as a sports car. It was actually sold as a two-seat commuter car, in part so that it wouldn't compete against the Corvette, or at least GM's management wouldn't perceive it to compete against the Corvette. But overall, the Fiero ended up becoming more than a sporty little automobile, particularly once it got a V6 engine in the 1985 model year. We're not going to highlight a lot of the technical details about the Fiero in this particular feature, but we are going to talk about the design. And the Fiero was very successful, particularly in its first year, when it sold almost 200,000 units. Of course, after that time frame, the Fiero's sales just started dwindling pretty considerably, and by the second year, it was selling about 75 to 80,000 units, and sales went down each year thereafter, in part because the Fiero had a reputation for not being, let's just say, the highest quality automobile, and in some cases for engine fires. But let's put that aside and talk about some of the design of the Fiero and what made it so unique and cool. Now, one of the first things to note about the Fiero is that it's one of very few Pontiacs not to have a split grille theme after the introduction of the 1959 Pontiacs. There are just a few Pontiacs in history after the introduction of that 1959 model year that really introduced that seminal split grille theme. After that, pretty much every Pontiac had it except for a few. The 1960 Pontiacs, as an example, didn't have it, the full-size Pontiacs, because, well, GM didn't know that that design trade was going to become so iconic and be so well received. But after that point, that split grille theme on Pontiacs just persisted all the way up until the end. A couple other Pontiacs that I can think of that didn't have the split grille theme would include the late 80s Pontiac 6000 STE after they went to the composite lamps from the sealed beam lamps. And also the cool late 80s, early 90s Bonneville SSE that was introduced. That one did not have a split grille either. But aside from that, there just aren't that many Pontiacs that fail to have the split grille. But aside from those minor items, which certainly don't detract from the car's overall appearance, I think it in fact is a very handsome little car. And that's one of the reasons why people ended up being a bit disappointed when they purchased one of the early ones with the 4-cylinder powering it, because it looked far more sporty than it actually was. You can imagine that a car like this deserves something with over 100 horsepower, and the 2.5-liter Iron Duke just wasn't up to the task. And in 1985, Pontiac would put the Chevrolet Source 2.8-liter 60-degree V6 under, well, not the hood, but under the rear deck lid, I guess. And that gave the car good performance, certainly for the time. But take a look at the side profile, and you're going to see a few things that you're not going to see on other cars. There's two in particular that I'm thinking of. I guess I could say three. Well, let's start with the third first, and that is that rub strip that runs the entire length of the vehicle. This was definitely atypical for the time frame, but it was typical on some General Motors composite body panel cars, like the Fiero, which has composite body panels and a structural steel space frame, as well as the C4 Corvette. And it kind of disguises some of the areas where the panels fit together, but I think it actually looks pretty good from a design standpoint overall. The second thing to notice is that little inlet that's ahead of the rear wheel below that rub strip. What in the world is that for? Well, it is, in fact, an air inlet. In fact, it's the air inlet or air intake for the engine under the deck lid. I had a 1988 Fiero GT back in the day, and I have to say it was kind of interesting because when you had the window rolled down, you heard this hissing noise, which was basically kind of the sound of a vacuum leak, because that would project the intake air noise very close to your ear if you had the driver's window rolled down. So this was one of the reasons why that little air inlet was nicknamed the Hoover, because it sounded like a vacuum cleaner. Very strange. I mean, it was fine. It didn't really get bothersome, but I remember when I first got the car and I put the windows down and I started it up, I thought I had a vacuum leak somewhere until I realized that the noise was just coming from that area, and it was simply because that was the intake for the engine on my 88 Fiero GT. You can see what I mean a little bit better with the rear deck lid raised here, and it exposes the 2.5-liter Iron Duke 4-cylinder engine. Notice where the air intake is. By the way, this engine is flipped around facing the front of the vehicle because this car is essentially using quite a bit of X-Car componentry for the rear suspension. And I mean the front part of the X-Car suspension. So in other words, GM basically took, and I'm oversimplifying here, but the X-Car's front suspension and engine cradle and rotated it around 180 degrees, and you have a little bit of the underpinnings for the Fiero rear suspension. The front suspension on the Fieros in most model years was really sourced from the Chevette, although in 1988, its final model year, GM did redo the entire suspension setup and, of course, made it great. This was during the time frame that GM owned Lotus, so Lotus helped with the design of that suspension, and then, of course, the car got canceled. So most people seek the 88s in part because of that reason, but also because it's the last year Fiero. Now let's return to the side profile of this 84 Fiero and talk about the final design element that I find very, very interesting on this car. And that is, take a look behind the window glass toward the rear of the car, past the pillar that has that little Pontiac logo on it, and see that piece of black trim there, that triangular piece of black trim. Well, what in the world is that? It looks like it's a window, but it's not. It's just fake. It's complete visual theater on this car. It's not a window to anywhere. The only purpose of that black plastic trim panel is to help minimize the look of the C-pillar and make it look thinner than it really is. It's kind of like a fake rear quarter glass. Again, that is not real glass. It is not a window to anywhere. It is simply a piece of visual theater. And I don't think I've really seen that done on another car, certainly from General Motors. I can't think of one, or even from Ford or Chrysler. Maybe somebody else did something in foreign makes. But I always thought that was interesting. The designers put that piece of fake black plastic there just to give the C-pillar a more slim look. And I have to say, imagine if that trim were not there and the C-pillar were basically painted and taking up that entire space. The car would look funny. The proportions just wouldn't look right. So I can't imagine the conversation that the designers had with the engineers where they kind of wanted to put that rear glass in, and the engineers said, well, it's a glass to nowhere. We can't do that. And I'm sure that it would have, let's say, had structural challenges if they had done that. So they elected to go with a very innovative solution, which was just to simply make that piece out of black plastic, and I think it works just fine. And here's that trim piece on another Fiero up close. You can see the little Pontiac logo in the pillar there, and then you have, this is a Fiero SE, hence the SE designation, but you can just see it's a piece of black plastic and there's nothing behind it. Kind of an interesting way to execute this design, but I think one that was novel and, as I said, quite effective. So what do you think? Is there any other car that really did this? I can only think of one other that comes to mind, and this is going to be humorous for those of you who are fans of American Motors, and that is the Renault Alliance convertible top. Yes, I said that right. The Renault Alliance convertible top. Why is that? Well, take a look at the picture here. This is a factory top, and notice the blackout area on the convertible top behind that rear quarter glass. That, again, was done simply from a design perspective to minimize the look of the C-pillar when the convertible top was up. It's a little bit hard to see, but look again at the picture if you can't see it, and look right behind the rear quarter glass. You'll see this little triangular shape of canvas that's part of the convertible top that's black, and then you'll see the white top, obviously, on this car. Again, that was done by the designers to simply minimize the look of the C-pillar on this car. And it's kind of funny because the Renault Alliance I wouldn't think is, a great design overall. It's not an ugly-looking car, and it actually was a pretty comfortable car. Unfortunately, it wasn't overly reliable, and that was really its Achilles heel. Otherwise, if you've driven a Renault Alliance, they actually drive pretty nicely. The suspension rides nicely. The pedal steel seats are pretty cool. And the torsion beam rear suspension is, again, the car just rides phenomenally well. I would say for an economy car of the era, it actually was a good car. It's just a shame it didn't have better reliability. But if you did get the convertible, you got that cool design feature. Thanks again for watching.